Hi, class. We are getting ready to start our fourth lecture. This should be about the fifth week of the semester so far. You just completed your first exam, and I'm sure you all did well on those. Looking forward to being able to grade those and the essay question and just hearing your thoughts and just continue to watch you grow and develop. Uh, Looking forward to this kind of next section of Church History 2. As I said initially, now we're going to look at a little more specifics, a few more specific details of some different followers. Today we are going to pick up with looking at Reformed theology, and we're going to look at um, kind of Reformed orthodoxy, if you will, and digging into all that is. So we're going to do a little recap to get started off. I know we began to discuss Reformed orthodoxy before the first exam, but I do kind of want to just jump back and recap that for you. In looking at orthodoxy and understanding our terminology orthodoxy, we're not talking necessarily as much about the historic Christian creeds that were agreed upon at various councils throughout church history, like the doctrine of the virgin birth, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of Christ being fully God and fully man. We're not talking about those kinds of orthodoxy, but it's something that you would maybe add to Christian orthodoxy that puts you into a specific camp, tradition, denomination, etc. We're looking at what makes a reformed person a reformed person. We're not looking at what makes them Christian, but what would classify someone as being reformed in the same way as what would classify someone as being Catholic or Baptist or holiness, those kinds of things. So if you want to look and know what comprises Reformed Orthodoxy, like I said before, you want to start with the proceedings of the Synod of Dort. So the Synod took place between November of 1618 and May of 1619. And the canons that the Synod came up with are comparable to what the Lutherans have in the Book of Concord. So again, everything that you want to know about what it means to be Lutheran can be found in the Book of Concord. Everything related to what it means to be Reformed can be found in these canons. So the difference is that the Book of Concord, contained documents that created Lutheran orthodoxy, such as Luther's longer and shorter catechism, and those kinds of things. These canons, though, for Reformed orthodoxy are actually decrees about 5 doctrinal points, and they offer clarification regarding Reformed beliefs on 5 doctrinal matters, and today we know them more popularly as the 5 points of Calvinism. So when we think of Reformed, we typically think of Calvin, John Calvin. However, it was really John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli who had more in common, and what we're going to see is that because Zwingli died so early, his followers were kind of grouped in with Calvin's followers. So followers of Zwingli and Calvin, think of them as like kids riding on the same bus. As boys and girls, the example we used before. It's like boys and girls on a school bus. They're on the same road, all humans, headed trying to head towards the same place, but they're still distinct. There are similarities between boys and girls, i.e., they're both humans, they eat, they sleep, those kinds of things. It's similar with Zwingli and Calvin. There's a lot of similarities between them, but they're still distinct. Both did come from the Swiss Reformation, and because Zwingli died so early during the Swiss Reformation, his followers get swallowed up into Calvin's camp because remember, there's some similarities there. So for the followers of Zwingli's Reformation, the sovereignty of God is the first principle of theology. Everything within their theological order derives from the fact that God is sovereign. Everything gets blamed or credited on God. Um, Again, they hold to such a high view of sovereignty that God is actively doing everything and everything is God's will. So these followers would be like John Piper today, so that salvation is seen within the sovereignty of God. Everything is a part of God's sovereign work. So if God, they would say if God is going to be sovereign, then he can pick who is going to be saved. So if you get picked, if you choose, if you want to get saved, then you don't have a sovereign Lord. That's how they view that in terms of God's sovereignty and salvation. God is picking who is going to be saved. Because if you get to pick if you're going to be saved, then God isn't sovereign because you chose and not him. And so for Calvin, it's a little different. Calvin's salvation, God's in the Calvinistic way of thinking, God's purpose in salvation is to create a people for himself. So in Calvin, in their theological belief and theological order, it's first about God's saving work. So today it would be like Al Mohler. So the reason God chooses who to save is because as a result of the fall, we have the inability to choose between right and wrong. So their thinking is that dead men can't choose, so God chooses them. So for Calvin, if God is not sovereign to save us from beginning to end, then we have no hope. So again, it's similar, sounds similar, but there's a distinction there between those two. So for Zwingli, it's all about God's sovereignty, God being able to choose. For Calvin, it's more about God's saving work, and that we are unable to choose, so God chooses us. So again, it sounds similar, but there's still a distinct nuance difference there. So essentially, if you view God's election before the fall, then you are really more of a follower of Zwingli. If you view that God elected people after the fall, then you're more of a follower of Calvin. So in Reformed Orthodoxy, what you see building here is that you have two threads. You have a Calvin thread and you have a Zwingli thread. And the biggest difference between the two is how the fall and election are related to each other, and then how they relate to the decrees of God. See, here, you cannot argue with the fact that there is an election that is used to describe believers over and again in the New Testament. And so you have that verbiage, you have that usage of election. So you cannot deny that there are the elect, those who are saved. But with these two groups, the difference is how do you view that election taking place? How is the fall and election related? So, and then how are they related to the decrees of God? And so the decrees that we're going to be looking at are salvation, means of salvation, that is Jesus' life, death, resurrection, predestination, the fall, and creation. So in terms of God's work, the story of the Bible has these 5 components to it, and theologians call this the 5 decrees of God. So none of those 5 things happen outside of God's knowledge or work. They are all a part of God's story. They are all a part of the story of God. That is salvation, the means of salvation, predestination, the fall, and creation. So now we're going to take a moment. We're going to break those 5 down and discuss them, elaborate on them, and then see how the different groups kind of order those decrees and how that forms their orthodoxy, how that forms what it means to be reformed. So we're going to first start off looking at predestination. And what predestination means is that God has somehow been actively involved in the eternal destinies of men and women prior to those destinies coming to fruition. That's what predestination is. It's that God has somehow been actively involved in the eternal destinies of men and women prior to those destinies coming to fruition. So there are 2 ultimate outcomes in eternity. It's either redemption or reprobation. You're either saved or you're part of the lost. Every person is ultimately saved or every person is ultimately lost. When someone dies, they have to fall in one of those 2 categories, the redeemed or the reprobate. So the means by which the ultimate destiny, that is salvation or damnation, the means by which the ultimate destiny of the redeemed is determined by God ahead of time, prior to those destinies coming to fruition, is election. That's what election is. It's the means by which the ultimate destiny of the redeemed is determined by God ahead of time, prior to those destinies coming to fruition. So when we talk about election or reprobation, we need to understand that they are both a part of predestination. Election and predestination are not the same. Election is a subset of predestination. So if you are to hear someone saying that election and predestination are the same, they're wrong. You cannot deny election. So when the scripture says that there is an elect group of people who you're saved, then you cannot deny it. So the scriptures does say and does describe believers as those who are the elect. So predestination is where God says you're going to hell or you're going to heaven. That is God, prior to the foundations of the world, knowing who is going to heaven and who is going to hell. So again, just to kind of review this, predestination, it's the means that God has somehow been actively involved in the eternal destinies of men prior to those coming to fruition. And the means by which the ultimate destiny is determined by God ahead of time, prior to those destinies coming to fruition, is election. God elected them. So for the followers of Zwingli, how God determines this is based totally on his sovereignty. For the followers of Calvin, how God determines this is based totally on him creating a people. So for the followers of Zwingli, the first decree of God prior to the foundation of the world is predestination. For them, predestination is both election and reprobation. So God is going to make a people for heaven, and God is going to make a people for hell, and he is going to be glorified because he displayed his sovereignty. That's how God would receive glory, is because he is displaying his sovereignty when before the foundations of the world, he chooses to create a people for heaven and create a people for hell. The second decree then for the followers of Zwingli is creation, because he needs people to be able to determine who goes to heaven or hell. So the second decree is creation, because again, he needs someone to send to heaven and he needs someone to send to hell. The third is the fall, and that is a means of judgment, because he needs a reason to send them to hell, because we do serve a just God. We serve a just God. He is fully just. And so he can't just send people to hell. There has to be a reason. So then the fall comes third. So the fall is not just the means of reprobation, though, but it's also the cause for the need of salvation. The fall is not just a means to justly send someone to hell, but also then creates the creates the need for salvation. So the elect are not just people who start out fine and dandy, but people who are lost and need to be found. And the fall is the means by which people become lost. So for the Zwinglians, you're not lost because you go out and sin, but because you're part of the fall. And then fourthly, the means of salvation, that is the life, death, and resurrection. And then lastly, application. That is when God applies that to the man or woman who is part of the elect. When God applies actual salvation to the man or woman who is part of the elect. So that's how the followers of Zwingli would organize these 5 decrees. The first is predestination, which includes election and reprobation. Then secondly, creation, because he needs someone to send to heaven and to hell. Thirdly is the fall, because he is a just God, so he needs a reason to send people to hell, but he also needs a reason for salvation. And then fourthly is the means of salvation, that is Jesus. And then lastly is the application, or salvation itself, the moment when God applies that to the man or woman who is part of the elect. So for the followers of Calvin, he has the same 5 decrees, just a different order. First is creation. God first creates the world, Adam and Eve. Second, the fall. Third, predestination. And here, predestination is based on the reality of the fall. Then fourth is the means of salvation, and the fifth is the application of salvation. So we have this, again, same 5 decrees, just different order. So creation first, then the fall, then predestination. So predestination here comes after the fall. And it's based on the reality of hell and God seeing that we are unable to choose life. So then he comes and chooses. Fourthly, the means, that is Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Fifthly, the application of salvation. And so the question that these two groups are aiming to answer, or trying to answer, is it sovereignty or love that is the basis of God's saving work? That's the ultimate question that these people are trying to answer. Is it God's sovereignty or love that's the reason why God saves? So the word that's used for the fall is called lapsis. And from that we get two different terms, supralapsarianism and infralapsarianism. Okay, and so for the followers of Zwingli, they're known as supralapsarians. So that is a lot of the basis for missions here is for the glory of God. God did all of this totally for his glory. And then the followers of Calvin are infralapsarianisms, and missions here then is the redemptive work of God as a consequence of the fall. It is God making a people of himself out of the mass of the reprobate. And so, again, followers of Zwingli are known as supralapsarianism, and Calvin, it's infralapsarianism. So did this happen, did this determination of God's work, occur before, before the fall, or after the fall? And so the disagreement with these two groups is over what came first, predestination or the fall. And this is important because it's ultimately going to determine how you share the gospel story. Grace is seen differently. And so, there are more options, but these are the options that the Reformed had. Either Zwingli, grace is the exercising of God's sovereignty, or Calvin, grace is the exercising of God's sovereignty out of a love for the reprobate. And so, in the middle of this discussion, in the middle of these followers, again, Zwingli's followers eventually get lumped into Calvin because he died so early on, and their views are very similar. They're very similar. But then we get another group entering the discussion known as the Remonstrants. So within this context, there is a group of people following the theologian Arminius, who says that the way to look at predestination is to look at it through the lens of God's foreknowledge. These people then, these followers of Arminius, craft a document known as the Remonstrants in 1610. And this is in response to the followers of Zwingli and the followers of Calvin. You see, the Arminians say that the Reformed group's view is problematic because they don't take into account God's foreknowledge. That is the fact that God knows everything, past, present, and future. So the Remonstrants, that is the Arminian party, they came to be known by this because they ascribed to the Remonstrants document. And so they decided to create a new list of decrees. So for them, the first decree then is God's creation, and creation here does include the fall. So the first decree is God's creation and fall. Second then, God decrees to appoint his Son as the Savior, so the means of salvation. Thirdly, to receive and to favor all who believe, that is, those who have faith and repent. God shows favor because people believe. Not people are received because God forces them to believe. Fourthly is prevenient grace, that is, God awakens those who are lost, enabling them to determine if they have the faith to believe or reject. This is the grace before saving grace. It is grace that enables you to choose if you want to respond to God in faith or reject him. Fifthly is predestination. So here, predestination is again based on foreknowledge. So all those who believe are the elect. So for the remonstrance, you are elect because God knows you will trust in Jesus. And the reprobate, they are those who are not going to trust in Jesus. So again, for the remonstrance, for the followers of Arminius, it's all again focused on God's foreknowledge. So any predestining going on is God already knew what you would do. So the Zwinglians and the Calvins, they then say that the remonstrances aren't reformed because they say the redeemed and the elect and reprobate are based on God's foreknowledge. So Zwingli and Calvin's camp says, you know what? You followers of Arminius, you're not reformed because you are basing it on God's foreknowledge, not out of God's love, not out of God's sovereignty, but foreknowledge. So the pastors of the followers of Zwingli and Calvin got together at the Synod of Dort. And here they issued the Canons of Dort, and the theological purpose was to include Zwingli and Calvin's teachings, but not the remonstrances, not the followers of Arminius. So those 5 canons are commonly known today as TULIP, or the 5 points of Calvinism. They cover all of Reformed theology. So T of TULIP, first one is total depravity. It's the affirmation that human beings are dead in their sins and are incapable of choosing Christ. They say that you're incapable of choosing life because you're a dead person. What do dead people do? Nothing. So as the Bible describes us as being dead, well then if we're dead, then we can't choose life because dead people don't do anything. So this isn't saying that humans are as depraved and evil as they possibly could be, but that every faculty of humanity is affected. Our hearts, our minds, our thoughts, our eyes, our hands, every faculty of the human being is affected by the fall. But despite people being dead in their trespasses, and because of God's love, He has elected some to life unconditionally. So U then is for unconditional election. An unconditional election means that they have been elected based on no conditions. It is simply that God chose to save a group of people based on no merit or any characteristics. That's all unconditional election means. We didn't do anything to earn it. We didn't deserve it. God just chose us. L is for limited atonement, also known as particular atonement. That's a belief that it's only those that are the elect that are the beneficiaries of Jesus' atoning work. The atoning work is limited to a particular group of people, that is, the elect. So here Jesus did not die for everyone in the world, only to atone for the sins of the elect. That's all that Jesus died for. I is for irresistible grace. That is, it is that those who are the elect find the grace of God irresistible, in the same way that a young man may find a young woman irresistible. She walks into a room and he's drawn to her. So those who are the elect, when they hear the gospel, they are desperate for it. What happens here is that the will of the sinner is changed so that you want the gospel. God never operates to the will of humans, but He does change their will. So you heard the gospel and you would have done anything for it. That is what irresistible grace is. God has changed your will so that you want it. It's not that you hear the gospel and accept it while fighting and screaming, trying to get away from the gospel, trying to get away from God's grace. That's not what irresistible grace is. It's that He changes your will so that when you hear the gospel, when you hear God's grace, that you then want it and you pursue it and you receive it and accept it. P then is for the perseverance of the saints. So this comes from Jesus when He says, those who remain until the end are the elect. If they are elect, then their trusting in Christ will persevere until the end. They will endure in faith because they are elect. So the only way to know if someone is elect is if they stay in the faith until the end of their life. The believer will not lose their salvation. And so that's what P is for the perseverance of the saints. And so that concludes, the teachings of the canons of the Synod of Dort, those 5 things. till depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. And remember, the followers of Zwingli and Calvin, put this together to the exclusion of Arminius, his followers, and their teachings. So they purposely wanted to exclude them, so that we, as humans, can't just choose if we want it or not. It's always, is God going to do it? And remember, the question is he doing it out of his sovereignty or out of his love? The question is not, can humans do it for Zwingli and Calvin's followers? They already affirmed that humans are dead, God does the choosing. For them, they're trying to answer when and how. For the remonstrances, well, God, awakens everyone to choose if they want it or not. And so then is the big difference. And so that forms the Reformed theology. If you believe something outside of that, then you're no longer Reformed. So I'm going to be posting a discussion question. Would love to get your thoughts and feedback on this. If you have any questions, please let me know. Take care and God bless.